Welcome back. We're talking about the latest tensions on the Korean Peninsula. The DPRK is set to celebrate its Day of the Sun, an annual holiday marking the birthday of its founder. In the past, the country has marked celebrations with nuclear tests. It remains to be seen if leaders will do the same this year. Meanwhile, the U.S. has sent a fleet of ships to the Korean Peninsula, saying it's just repositioning. To examine these developments, Tian Wei is still with us from Beijing. She's the host of CGTN's daily news talk show, World Insight. With us in the studio, Brian Becker is National Coordinator of the Answer Coalition and an expert on DPRK U.S. relations. And from Rhode Island, Vladimir Golstein is a professor of Slavic Studies at Brown University. Tian Wei, let me start with you this time. The DPRK, as I mentioned, about to celebrate a big major holiday. Analysts believe there could be another nuclear test to commemorate this holiday. If that happens, what would the regional fallout be? Because there's been a lot of tension over this over the past few weeks.
There are, as you may know, a lot of concerns from this part of the world. China, of course, being a very important mediator of the six-party talks, which did not happen recently over the past few years, and also a country in the region are extremely concerned about the situation. You heard the Chinese Foreign Minister Wang has been extremely using extreme words to calm down the two sides, particularly the DPRK and the United States. China had said very clearly over the days, months, and years, it has been an issue directly between the United States and the DPRK. China suggests about double suspension, the way to go for seek a peace and stability of the Korean Peninsula nuclear issue. But it seems that at this point, both sides, U.S. and DPRK, have been pushing to an extreme, and the tension is extremely high. Many people here in China are extremely concerned about the latest development.
And one of those other developments is the fact that the United States is moving these warships to the Korean Peninsula. As I mentioned, it calls it repositioning, but the U.S. fleet has been joined by Japan, several Japanese destroyers. What, Tian Wei, is China's response to these developments?
As I said earlier, the Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi has been calling on both parties, the U.S. and the DPRK, to calm down and restrain their actions. Of course, there are political agendas for both the DPRK and the U.S. to act to the extent that they are. Chinese President Xi Jinping, during his visit to the United States, according to later the media reports, had explained very clearly to President Trump about the history of China over the past hundreds and thousands of years and its relations with the Korean Peninsula, and also has been advocating the restraint from both sides, once again, DPRK and the United States, on this issue as well. Meanwhile, you also see the Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi pick up his phone last night, Beijing time, to talk to the Russian counterpart, try to figure out a way of calming down both sides, DPRK and the United States, with a united front. But at the same time, China has been saying from the very beginning that THAAD deployment is not going to be helpful for anyone, because it's only likely to erode the very little trust among all the countries involved on the nuclear issue on the Korean Peninsula.
Okay, Brian, the United States may threaten the DPRK, but really, what options does the U.S. have? I mean, you're talking about a country that has nuclear weapons. Another factor, I guess, which has to be considered is the fact that there's something like 28,000 United States troops on the border with South Korea. I mean, what can the United States do?
Well, the United States could take military action. In other words, there could be elements within the U.S. military who have been given carte blanche by the Trump administration. We know that. They're unrestrained right now. That's why they dropped the mother of all bombs in Afghanistan, because they could, a 21,000 bomb. I don't think that's likely, but it could happen. If it were to happen, North Korea has immense military capabilities to strike the 30,000 U.S. troops that are in South Korea, U.S. troops that are in Japanese military bases. In other words, it would get ugly very quick, and it would lead, I believe, to a regional conflict. So perhaps that will be a deterrent. Hopefully that will be a deterrent. It has been a deterrent in the past. Donald Trump, though, is an unpredictable political figure, and he's staking a lot on his ability to make everybody move the way he wants them to move. The fact that he sent 59 cruise missiles while he was having dessert with the Chinese president, that was not only arrogant and not only a breach of diplomatic protocol, but sending a message to China and telling China, you solve the problem with North Korea. I think politically, Trump is also trying to break DPRK and China apart. Of course, there's a long relationship, as we've heard. 180,000 Chinese volunteers died when the U.S. tried to take over North Korea in 1951, 52, 53. Historic relationship, and they're border countries. They share a border. I think what China wants right now, of course, and what the world wants, what the Koreans want, is to calm things down. What does that really mean? It means there must be negotiations again, and finally the Korean War must come to an end. Most wars have a beginning and an end. This war could end with a peace treaty, which is what the DPRK really wants, not military exercises every 6 months that simulate its own destruction.
Well, the Chinese foreign minister, in fact, did offer that, as Tian Wei pointed out. There was the double suspension proposal.
Yes, I mean, you had the DPRK under Obama and now under Trump saying, we won't do any more tests, we'll suspend them, there will be a moratorium. If you cancel war exercises that are called decapitation war exercises and simulate the destruction of North Korea, why does Washington say no right off the bat? Why not talk?
Vladimir, Russia is watching this very closely. In fact, Tian Wei just told us a moment ago that the Russian foreign minister has held a discussion with his Russian counterpart on this very issue. Here's Sergei Lavrov talking about this.
Russia and the U.S. are particularly committed to trying to find solutions to other problems and try and avoid confrontation in Korea, the Korean Peninsula, and to start a negotiation process in order to settle the question of stabilizing the Korean Peninsula through political and diplomatic efforts.
So the Russians are putting their faith there in a diplomatic solution to this. How concerned is Russia about this latest turn of events, and what can Moscow do?
Well, Russia is very much concerned because what we have to, what is going on, we have to be aware of that there are traditional allies, be it Syria, ally of Russia, be it North Korea, ally of China, and America is threatening both of them. So it's very interesting how these two countries, meaning Russia and China, are going to watch it. So, there is it appears to me, a rather myopic policy that, of course, neocons want to push America to flex its muscle to show how strong it is. But it might be inadvertently pushing, China and Russia together, because the speaking up on their allies is a rather myopic policy. So I suspect that Russia is watching it very closely because, sooner or later, these countries, Russia and China, have to present a unified front as a multilateral world. And, I suspect that sooner or later, the United States will change its doctrine. For the time being, they still operate under presumption that they have a full spectrum dominance and they can sort of push countries around. But I also agree that most likely there's not going to be a military situation. Trump flexes his muscle, silences his critics, shows that he can be tough, shows that he is not afraid individually, neither of Russia nor United States, and that's about it. I don't think it will escalate any further.
All right, Tian Wei, there have been very tough words coming out of Washington on this issue. Let's take a listen to what President Trump had to say.
I don't know if this sends a message. It doesn't make any difference if it does or not. North Korea is a problem. The problem will be taken care of. I will say this. I think China has really been working very hard. I have really gotten to like and respect, as you know, President Xi.
Is there a bit of a mixed message there, Tian Wei? On the one hand, President Trump threatening the DPRK, on the other hand, saying China and President Xi are working very hard to defuse this crisis.
Well, China has been working very hard from day one. At the very early stage, the six-party talks that eventually got all the parties involved to sit down and try to resolve at least the problem through diplomatic and peaceful means. And that has been continuing that effort. And later, China worked with many in the United Nations on the Security Council resolutions. China has been sending back, as we have heard from media reports, the coal, so-called imports from North Korea, DPRK, to China. And China this time, after the talk between the two presidents in Florida, China sent its envoy, Mr. Wu Dawei, to South Korea immediately. China has been working, as I mentioned earlier, the foreign minister Wang Yi and many of his colleagues here in China working extremely hard around the clock in order to avoid big crisis. I was earlier also talking to the Chinese ambassador to the United States, Mr. Tian Wei. He said something extremely clear. That is, China's goal here is to maintain the peace and stability here on the Korean Peninsula, because China is in the neighborhood. And the biggest concern of China is, of course, China's own national security and peace. And that coincides with the security and peace of the Korean Peninsula and of Northeast Asia. So what China is trying to do, you know very well, is to try everybody to calm down, particularly at this point, not to go to the stage that nobody could reverse the clock anymore. That is very important.
Okay, Brian, very quickly, I've got about 15 seconds left. There is a blueprint, a pathway to get diplomatic negotiations going. That's the six-party talks. Whatever happened to them?
The six-party talks were shelved because the United States lost interest in them. The DPRK also lost a bit of interest. What the DPRK actually wants is bilateral relations, bilateral talks with the United States. But short of that, there certainly should be the resumption of six-party talks.
Okay, and that's where we have to leave it. Thanks to all of you for joining us. That's all we have time for. Join us on the next episode of The Heat. How are tensions in the DPRK affecting the region? Until then, I'm Arnold Naidu in Washington, D.C. Thanks for being with us.